Apologize. Last week, I know some of you showed up. I was AWOL. I think most of you know the reason was that my dear mother went to be with the Lord the Thursday before that Sunday. And I tried to get the message to the church in time that it would prevent folks from making the trip here to this class for naught, but I know some of you didn't hear about that. I appreciate many expressions of appreciation for her life and expressions of sympathy to the rest of us who were left behind here. Have really indeed appreciated that very much. It's been an interesting week or so, just working through all the things that you deal with, but God has been very gracious, and this has been a rich time for our family as we've thought about Mom and all that she meant to us. There will be a memorial service. I think you may know this today at 2 o'clock, so if you're able to make it, we'd love to have you. It'll be a brief service, I'm sure much less than an hour, but just a time to reflect on what a blessing she was to me and to our family, and I know to many of you as well. We are coming this morning to the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus. So, who has your Bibles? All right, that's good. Good showing. A few more on this side, I think. Okay, yeah, you get partial credit now. I am going to be using, at least for openers, the Pew Bible. It's handy. If I forget mine, I can just run into the sanctuary and grab one, which is what I did this morning. This is the New Revised Standard Version, so for lack of anything better, if you want to use one of these, that'd be great. There's usually a few around, and so feel free to make use of that. If you have a preferred version, then that's fine as well. So whatever you wish to bring, I think you'll find there's pretty much common agreement among the translators as to how these texts should be rendered, although there's little variations here and there along the way. So we'll be working with the New Revised Standard. This morning, I want to do some preliminary stuff, so I hope you'll just bear with me. This is just, I have a little bit of OCD about this. I have to get these things off my chest. What's the historical setting, kind of some of this. It may not be burning issues to you, but when you start thinking about a book like Exodus, we just have to ask these questions. And so we'll be doing a little bit that may not be fully inspiring, but I hope it'll be educational, and I hope as we read through Exodus, we'll find that this is useful data. So that's the plan. I'll probably take upwards of half the time just doing some of this preliminary stuff. My hope is that we'll make it down to about verse 14 of chapter 1 today. We'll see. That's my plan. And so we'll do our best. Let's just go ahead and start with prayer, and then we'll get going. Heavenly Father, we do deeply appreciate the wonder of your grace, which has been working through history for thousands of years. And we stand in awe of the fact that the same mighty arm that led your people out of Egypt and liberated them from bondage is the same mighty arm that is at work in our own lives, that we can pray to this same God and that we can expect to see the same kinds of wonderful works of power in our own lives. And we pray that as we are nurtured and educated by these stories, that you would increase our faith thereby and cause us to be those who, with ever more profound insight, look to Christ, who is the author and finisher of our faith, and we ask this in his name. Amen. Well, Exodus is the second book in the Bible. So, turn way back, and you find Genesis, and then you find Exodus. Some of you were in the class that we did, I think about 5 years ago, in which we studied Genesis. And I made a note to myself at the time someday I want to come back and pick up this story, you know. We sort of left it there hanging with Joseph, Jacob, the patriarch, there in Egypt. And, of course, that's only the beginning of the story. That story in Genesis is where God calls out a family, gives great promises of grace, but, of course, it's only the beginning, and there's much, much more. So now we come to Exodus. I don't know if within my lifetime I'll be able to make it through all the Old Testament, but we're at least taking another nibble at it here, so that's the plan. The book of Exodus is also the second book of what's called the Hebrew Torah. I think you know that word. It means law. It's the Hebrew word for law. And it comprises the first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament, or what is called the Hebrew Scriptures. There's been a lot of debate in the history of the Jewish religion about what books should be regarded as canonical and what books are not. Not all Jewish people agree that the books we call the Old Testament are in fact properly the canonical scriptures. Some add what's called the Apocrypha, which you'll find in Roman Catholic Bibles. Some subtract. There are some to this day who would say the only true canon is the first 5 books, something like the Sadducees did back in the 1st century in Jesus' day. The only canon they recognized was these 5 books, but everybody agrees here. Everybody concurs these books belong in the canon. So we are, in a sense, on holy ground when we come to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So we come with a certain degree of respect for that. Moses is the purported author. In my opinion, he is the author. So I'm not going to apologize for that anymore. I'm just going to say it right up front, but I am willing to grant that there's a huge amount of debate about that. And critical scholars, of course, continue to insist that Moses couldn't have written these documents, that they were compiled over many centuries and edited and redacted and so on, and Moses is probably just a mythical character and so on. I'm not going to fiddle with that. I'm not going to labor that. If that's what you think, fine, but I'm not going to debate that point. I'm just going to assume what the New Testament assumes, that Moses is the substantial author of these 5 books. We know he didn't write all of it. For example, the last chapter of Deuteronomy is a eulogy. We assume Moses didn't write his own eulogy, you know. You have other points where it seems there was a little bit of editorial work later. That's fine. I don't think anybody has to get too juiced up or excited or concerned about that. That's to be expected. But that Moses is the substantial author of these has certainly been the classic view of the church. It's been the classic view of the Jewish religion. And who am I to take all of those on? So I'm just going to make that assumption. And I think it's a pretty safe assumption to make. The book of Exodus includes within it one of 2 great covenants that we find in the Old Testament. And I have tried with something less than literary brilliance, or I should say, I guess, artistic brilliance, to indicate how these covenants all tie together. They're all connected to certain people. There's 6 of them in the Old Testament, 2 that are major, that are most famous. The first one with Abraham in Genesis, the second one with Moses, which is in Exodus. But there's 4 more. They do form a kind of chiasm. In other words, there's a correlation between the first of these and the last of them. There's a correlation between the second and the 5th of them. And there's a correlation between Abraham and Moses, and all of them taken together, sort of like a pyramid, point to the ultimate covenant, the 7th of them, which doesn't arrive until the New Testament. So when Jesus is there at the Last Supper and he takes the cup and he says, "This cup is the New Testament in my blood," and that reference to blood is critical. In a sense, that covenant in which we share as God's people in the New Covenant era incorporates by reference all the rest of these. Every one of them in some ways is pointing to that great covenant. Conspicuous among them is the covenant we find in Exodus. And so when we ask for a historical or maybe a theological context for this book, we really need to appreciate that it's this covenant in Moses That is really at the center of this entire book and gives it some connection then to what we as Christians understand to be our life of faith in the New Covenant era. What is a covenant? A covenant is an agreement supported by an oath and usually solemnized by the shedding of blood. So in the Old Testament, in the ancient Near East, it was not uncommon for various political leaders, if they were going to form a treaty or otherwise come to some sort of agreement, in the practice that was common in that time, they would make those agreements, they would swear their oaths, and then they would shed blood, usually the blood of an animal. One of the most dramatic examples of that is what we find in the book of Genesis, chapter 15, where Abraham is told to offer animals, split them apart, and then God moves down through the middle of that. Remember that, Genesis 15? Well, that's kind of what would happen. The blood would be shed, and the two monarchs would sometimes actually walk literally through the blood. The meaning of that was to say, if I don't fulfill my duties under this covenant, may my blood be shed just as these animals' blood has been shed. So when you look at the covenants in the Old Testament, you find they follow that kind of paradigm. And every one of these, you'll see there's some similarity there. The most famous first covenant that we run into is that which was with Abraham. It's renewed and repeated, beginning in Genesis chapter 12 down to chapter 22. Probably the highest moment of that covenantal transaction is found in Genesis 15, which is where Abraham is said to believe the Lord. It was imputed to him for righteousness, but then we have this elaborate kind of sacramental moment in which that thing is solemnized. That's the covenant that creates a people, calls Abraham. It's gracious. It is unilateral. God comes to Abraham. We have no intimation that Abraham was looking for God. He's just living there in Ur of the Chaldees. But God comes to him. That's clearly the force of the text, and calls him, you see, sovereignly out of that place to a place that God would show him. Calls him away from one life to a new one. And that great drama, of course, we looked at in connection with our studies of Genesis some years back. The book of Exodus now gives to those people order, civil order and religious order. It creates a nation, and a nation needs law. So what we have in Exodus is the ordering of these people. This is very much what happens with us as Christians, you know. God calls us by grace. He doesn't care whether you've got an ordered life or not at the beginning. He just calls you. Your life may be completely messed up. Doesn't matter to him. This is not a situation of clean yourself up and then maybe God will accept you. No, God calls you, whatever the situation of your life is, but then he orders your life. He doesn't just leave you there. He gives you that rule by which we are to live. And so Christians have a great kind of identification with these two. We appreciate the great call that came to Abraham of grace. We also appreciate that God then gives to his people graciously that way of life which will be for their good, which will be for their benefit. The Ten Commandments and so on. We're not saying at this point that we're supposed to live point for point by the same rule that was given to the Israelites of the ancient world, but that there is a rule for the life of the faith of Christian people is given. Jesus, on the Sermon on the Mount, of course, is giving us, as it were, a rule. So those are the big ones, but there's four others. The first covenant that we find way back here is the one that God made with Adam. What verse? Anybody know off the top of your head? Where do we find God's covenant with Adam? There'll be a test at the end, you know. Okay, get this down. Genesis 3:15. All right, famous verse, sometimes called the proto-evangelion, the first announcement of the gospel. It's associated with the shedding of blood, you recall, because Adam and Eve are naked, and they have now discovered that of themselves, and God sheds blood, the blood of animals, to atone, to cover their nakedness. Great, rich imagery there. And the fact that it's a covenant made with Adam is supposed to be, for us, an indication that that's a covenant that reaches to the whole world. Adam stands at the head of the entire human race. And so the promise that was given to him is coextensive with all of humanity, not just Jewish humanity or, Northern European humanity or American humanity or whatever, but it's all humanity is incorporated there. The counterpart to that, assuming a kind of chiasm among these, is the covenant that's made in connection with Ezra. And you have to read Ezra and Nehemiah together and kind of look for it. It's not quite as dramatically poignant, but it's certainly there. This is sometimes called the Restoration Covenant. This is the covenant that was made by God's people when they were restored to the land to Jerusalem in particular, authorized to rebuild the temple, which had been destroyed by the Babylonians, and the terms, the stipulation by which they were sent back to Jerusalem this was both by Cyrus the Persian and by Darius, another Persian, successor to him, was you should offer your morning and evening sacrifices and pray for me, you see. So Cyrus, this pagan, says, go to Jerusalem and pray for me, and pray for my sons, and pray for the empire. It's very interesting, isn't it? Now, that doesn't mean he was a great inspired spirit, because he told all of the people in his domain to do the same thing. He didn't know which God was the right one, but he knew somebody out there had the right God, and he wanted whatever that God was to be blessing him, So he was equal opportunity in his support of religions across the board, but that was Persian policy. That was their official policy, to return people to their homeland, people that had been deported by the Babylonians and the Assyrians in earlier years. So they were kind of restoring people, and they restored the Jewish people. You read the first few verses of Ezra, and you see the announcement that's given there, from Cyrus authorizing that return. Well, you see, again, it has a worldwide scope. Those offerings that were being given were not simply for Jewish people or for the people around town, or for those who were in some kind of unique class. This, again, was intended to be of benefit to the entire world. In that case, the Persian world, which as far as they knew was the whole world. So you have here this covenant with Adam and this covenant with Ezra, both promising redemptive benefits to the world. It has that kind of scope. Now, the next two are the covenants, first of all, with Noah, and then with David. The covenant with Noah is right after the flood. And again, there's sacrifice. And Noah kind of standing in the same position as Adam. The whole human race has been wiped out, and there he is with his family. Is given a covenant, and the rainbow is there, and that sort of thing. But the thing that is added now is that there is in Genesis 9:6 and in that whole text the authorization of human government with God's sanction. Up until that point, you don't see that. You see only examples of government by raw force. The ante-deluge period, the period preceding the flood. You don't have any indication of this. Now, God says to Noah these words. He says, if a man sheds a man's blood, then by man his blood must be shed, because in God's image this one was created. And that, of course, we read on its face. It's kind of the authorization of capital punishment. I don't want to get off on capital punishment right now. That's beside the point. But, people will grant that's what's going on. Certainly capital punishment was commonly practiced in the Old Testament. I'll leave for another time a discussion of, what we should do about it today. But the point is, this becomes God's judicial work being carried out by people. God's great judicial action up until that point had been the flood. He just wipes them out in a kind of great, cataclysm. And now he comes back and says, okay, from now on, I'm going to entrust into human hands this business of exercising God's judgment. So, if a man sheds a man's blood, by man his blood will be shed. And that legitimizes and solemnizes human government. Government is no longer government by raw force. It's no longer might makes right. Now government, strictly speaking, is supposed to understand that it's carrying out God's work. And of course, the New Testament text that's most famous for reaffirming that particular idea is found, New Testament text, is found in
Got a slow move here.
I guess so. What book of the New Testament? Just take a guess. I think Mr. Dresbach might know the answer to that, huh? I go with Romans. Good. Can you pull out the chapter, my son? 13 is excellent, yes. Right, and I did not prep him for this, so I'm very happy. Yeah, Romans 13. Romans 13 is that text in which we find God, authorizing human government. Paul says there that the government, that the powers that be are ordained by God. So that's the New Testament affirmation of that. But as far as we can tell, that's where it happens. So this is a covenant that gives this authority of God to human institutions. The answer to that is over here with the government of the so-called Davidic covenant, 2 Samuel chapter 7. You recall the story there is that David wants to build a house for God. He's defeated his enemies. Things have settled down a little bit. Life is looking good, and he says to himself, and in fact says to his prophet friend Nathan, I think I'll build a house for God. Nathan comes back after giving an initial thumbs up and says, no, thumbs down. God says, David, you want to build a house for me? No. I'm going to build a house for you, And that house that God would build for David would become David's dynasty. The first expression of it would be in his son, Solomon, who would build a house for God. But there would be a greater son of David who would build a greater house for God out in the future. And that, of course, is the one that we otherwise know of as Messiah, who is called critically in the New Testament the Son of David. That's one of the titles that's given to him. What does that title mean? Well, the promise to David was that he would have a son who would sit on the throne of David and govern not just Israel, but the nations forever. It's a pretty whopping promise, The New Testament comes along and affirms concerning Messiah, Jesus' parting words to his disciples, all authority has now been given to me in heaven and where? On earth. That includes political authority. That's why Revelation says unabashedly, Christ is the ruler of the kings of the earth. He's the ruler of presidents. He's the ruler of senators. He's the ruler of kings and queens. He's the ruler of potentates and dictators and tyrants. And every one of them is going to answer to King Jesus for how he discharged his duties. That's the New Testament posture. So the politics of this world matters to us because we see a connection between the rule of King Jesus and this son of David who was going to be installed. Well, do you notice how this again is government? It's the answer, in a sense, to that which was entrusted to Noah way back when, after the flood. So it begins here with the institution of government. It culminates with this one who will be the greatest governor of all. That's the idea. And then we have the final two that we looked at already briefly. Abraham, who's called by grace. Now notice this is very restrictive. So far, all four of these have a kind of international, if you will, global scope. But now God calls an individual person. And from him forms a family, and from him forms what amounts to a clan. And that, of course, is largely what we find in Genesis. And then in the book of Exodus, that clan, now grown into a substantial number of people, is created as a nation and given the order of a nation. And of course, from a New Testament point of view, we understand that's what God has done. The people of God were baptized, Paul says, in the Red Sea. We are baptized in a sort of Red Sea. The waters of baptism bring us in to this nation that God has created. And so we see an echo of all of this in our own experience. So, in a really kind of broad and somewhat superficial way, the theological context for Exodus, I think, is best understood in light of these other covenants that are going on in the Old Testament, and we should kind of keep that in mind as we pursue an examination of it. So far, so good? Okay. Now let's take a look at the text. That was all introduction. And so if you'd like to take your Bibles now. We will, if all goes well, make it down to about verse 14. I hope. We'll see. So let's start by reading it. We're in Exodus chapter 1, beginning at verse 1 down to verse 14. This, my friends, is the Word of God. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total number of people born to Jacob was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed upon them. So that is the initial text, and let's just look at it line by line here. Some lines a little more than others, but we have these first 2 or 3 verses that tick off for us then the 12 tribes or the 12 sons of Jacob. That is virtually a direct quote from Genesis 35:23, and it is one of many occasions in which the author here is attempting to tie Exodus with Genesis. These are not to be seen as discrete, isolated, separate stories, unconnected, but it's one continuous drama that's unfolding. And so we're reminded by this reference to the tribes of the story that we've already seen in Genesis, which is that God called Abraham and then promised him a son. And of course he eventually had a son, in fact several sons eventually, Isaac, and after that Jacob. And Jacob had 12 sons, 10 of whom, fueled by their jealousy, sold their poor brother when he was probably in his mid-teens as a slave to the Egyptians. Hauled off, looks like a big catastrophe, but of course we find out at the end of the story this was actually God's providence. What they intended for evil, God intended for good. Genesis 50:20. Joseph himself came to recognize that, of course, over time. And so we have that story then of all of these people being transported down to Egypt in the midst of this great famine, and that, I think, is familiar to you, that whole story. It's interesting, in the Old Testament, we talk casually about the 12 tribes of Israel. There are actually, you probably know, how many tribes of Israel? Many know? 13. 13. Because Jacob adopted the 2 sons of Joseph. Jacob had 12 sons, but he adopts the 2 sons of Joseph, whose names are Ephraim and Manasseh. And so in the Old Testament, we commonly hear of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. We don't hear of the tribe of Joseph, do we? Well, you add them all up, it's 13. What do you make of that? Well, all the way through the Old Testament, that becomes a subtle way in which the author will play with his meaning. He will list the tribes, sometimes including, sometimes excluding a certain tribe, in order to make a subtle point. And if you're not paying attention, you might miss that point. So the next time you kind of come across tribes being mentioned in your Old Testament reading, kind of keep an eye on that, because that is part of how the authors will communicate their intended meaning in a subtle sort of way. But be that as it may, we have what are commonly called the 12 tribes. And they all, of course, come out of these 12 characters, actually 13, who all go down into Egypt. Now, the Hebrew text reads, the total number of people born to Jacob was 70, which is not quite correct. It's actually 75. It seems the Hebrew text here means the total number that were born to Jacob who remained in Canaan was 70, and it's excluding then from that number those who were already in Egypt, and it goes ahead and actually says, right after that, Joseph was already in Egypt. The official Greek version of the Old Testament is called the Septuagint, the LXX. It actually translated this 75. The translators there were trying to fix what they thought was a problem. I don't think it's a problem, but it was understood that the 70 was only those who were in Canaan. 5 more were with Joseph in Egypt. It would be Joseph, his 2 sons, and 2 grandsons. Altogether were the 5. When Stephen is preaching to the Sanhedrin, as we find in Acts chapter 7, he says there were 75. So Stephen goes with the Septuagint there, you know. So anyway, it's a tiny little point. I doubt that any of you woke up this morning burning with anxiety about that number problem, but just in case, we'll address that. Well, Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph and all his brothers died, that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so the land was filled with them. Okay, so they multiplied. Again, this is a point where sometimes people have a little heartburn because they don't know how a relatively small number of people could just grow, ballooning into a huge number, at least by the biblical record, well over 1 million in that period of time. Couple of things to bear in mind about this. One, it was probably considerably more than 75 people who went from Canaan to Egypt. There was always a good-sized group, community, that were associated, even clear back with Abraham, with him and his ministry. You recall the story of Abraham. He had 318 soldiers, let alone all of their families and so on, that he went out in a battle. You recall that in Genesis chapter 14. If you read Genesis carefully, you'll notice that there are many allusions to what appears to be a much larger group. These guys were sheiks. They weren't just kind of obscure Bedouins, wandering around. They were people of huge wealth who were well known and had a good-sized community attached to them. And so at least the best evidence is that when Jacob moved to Egypt, he probably went there with a couple of thousand people or more. It was a huge group. And they were all considered legitimate members of this group, this covenant community. And so we're not starting with 70 or 75 people. We're starting with probably 1,500 to 2,000 or more. And even over a couple of hundred years, at normal rates of production, you'll get well over 1 million people at that rate, you see. So it's not, the arithmetic is actually not as challenging as it may seem at first brush. How long were they in Egypt? Well, does anyone want to say off the top of your head, how long were the Jewish people in Egypt? Just say it, be brave. 400 years. Isn't that a common view? It's wrong. That's why we come to Sunday school, friends. The people of Israel were in Egypt for 215 years. Some of you think I've just said something that is heretical, but work with me here. The number 400 is actually the number we see elsewhere, 430. You see that number in Exodus 12:40. It's mentioned one or two other times in the Old Testament, but most importantly, Paul himself uses that number. A close reading makes it clear that the 430 is not a reference to the time that the people of God were in Egypt, but it is a measure of the time that lapsed from the covenant with Abraham to the covenant with Moses. That is 430 years. Now, if you don't like it because I said it, then I'm just going to appeal to the Apostle Paul. And if you don't like the fact that he said it, then that's a different problem, But he says in Galatians 3:17, take a look at it. He talks about two covenants, the one with Abraham and the one that came 430 years later with Moses, Now, if that's true, if it's 430 years from Abraham's covenant to Moses' covenant, then that means the time they were in Egypt is just about half that, which would be about 215 years. The time that the children of Israel were oppressed in Egypt was about half again of that, just a little over 100 years, beginning, in my opinion, with the 18th dynasty. It's a separate question we'll look at in a minute. So anyway, just to kind of get our ducks in a row here, that's the approach I think that makes sense to this. All right. So they grew, they multiplied, they became exceedingly strong. The land was filled with them. Some commentators believe that the people of Israel who had started in the land of Goshen by this time may have spread throughout many other regions of Egypt. So they were no longer, probably still lower Egypt or northern Egypt, but maybe some of the other populated centers as well. All right, let's look at verse 8. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Who's this guy? Now this is a hot controversy. And this is your lucky day, because I'm going to give you the right answer. All modesty aside, of course, but I do have respect for both sides of this, but I think one has to be correct here. Even though I will frankly grant that once again, as is so often the case, I find myself in the minority. So you'll have to have your guard up, your defenses up, critical apparatus operating, because this is not the majority view. But there are two views as to when the Exodus took place. There's more than that, but two major views. One is called the late date, and it would put it under the reign of Ramses II, or someone in that time frame. That's 19th dynasty, really 13th century BC. Ramses the Great, if you ever see these images of great Egyptian pharaohs, invariably Ramses the Great, Ramses II will be among them. He's one of the most well-known. He was powerful. He fought great battles. The most famous was the battle at Kadesh in 1276, in which he defeated the Hittites. At least he said he did. History is somewhat disputed on that point. But he had about 100 children, literally. Many wives, and it was just grand-style Egypt. The difficulty with that view is that certainly there's no trace of a reference, either explicitly or by any kind of inference, to an Exodus event that meets the proportions that we find in Exodus. So generally this is the view taken by more liberal Old Testament scholars who tend to minimize the trauma reflected by the Exodus. They tend to style it as more or less a kind of migration that took place. Something strange happened in a reed sea somewhere, and some chariots got stuck in the mud, and later, hundreds of years later, the Jewish people just embellished that story beyond all recognition, made it a huge legendary kind of event, and made it the creating, defining event of their national existence. So now I'm overstating that to some degree, but that would be kind of the flavor of those who take that view, because there's just no record of any great trauma that takes place under Ramses II. He started strong and just got stronger. There was never anything that would have looked like something like that. The main argument in favor of it is, of course, the reference to the two supply cities in verse 11. They're called Pithom and Ramses. And there's no reference to any Ramses at all in Egyptian history until the 19th dynasty. And so it would have to be a huge anachronism, so the story goes, to have it take place earlier when that name, Ramses, was not current. in Egypt. You see the problem? I know this is probably more technical than some of you even care about. That's why I'm unburdening my soul here. Do you understand that? I have to do this. So just be patient. We will get to good stuff sooner or later. Stuff that actually matters. But, all right. So anyway, what's the other view? The other view is that these events took place during the 18th dynasty. This tends to be adopted by more conservative scholars, and both sides have a problem. The early date folks have to deal with this problem of Pithom and Ramses. That's a problem, so just grant it right up front. The late date folks have to deal with the fact that what they're embracing flatly contradicts what the Old Testament actually says. So if you look at a text, which is the most important on this, it's 1 Kings 6. And in 1 Kings 6, we have the account of Solomon beginning the construction of the temple. And the author there says that it was in the 4th year of Solomon, and then he adds with some degree of precision, which was the 480th year after the children of Israel came out of Egypt. Right? That seems pretty clear-cut. Now we have a general consensus as to when Solomon reigned. There'd be a little bit of quibbling here, but not much. This would be pretty much granted. Assuming there was a Solomon and he reigned as purported in the Scriptures, he would have started reigning in about the year 970. The 4th year of his reign would be 967. Okay, so that would be the year that the temple was, the beginning of the construction of the temple. 480 years is added to that. What does that give us? The year 1447, which would be about 150 to 200 years earlier than the Ramses era. So there you've got it. Some would put it in the 1200s, some put it in the 1400s. As I say, it tends to be more conservative types who put it here earlier. My own view, and I don't by any means hold myself out as any kind of Old Testament scholar, but I've looked at it and I've kind of weighed it back and forth, and my own view tilts pretty heavily toward the earlier date. So that's what I'm going to assume. And from this point on, I'm not going to defend that over and over. I'm just going to tell you that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, So there we are. I do have to deal with the problem of Pithom and Ramses. That's an issue, so we'll have to deal with that as we have opportunity. But this puts us squarely in the middle of one of the most fascinating periods of Egyptian history, the 18th dynasty of any era. It's really wonderful. This is the one that produced Thutmose the third, is one of the greatest military strategists, or Thutmose if you prefer. Akhenaten, that strange pharaoh who was a monotheist. Tutankhamun, who of course was a kind of minor king, but we discovered his stuff over there and it's paraded around the world these days. All of these are 18th dynasty carriers. It's a fascinating time. Who was the pharaoh in Egypt in 1447? Guy by the name of Amenhotep II. Great guy. All right, Amenhotep II. Amenhotep II. He started ruling Egypt in 1450 and ruled for about 30 years. If he was the ruler, and by the way, this date is very, very widely accepted. This is by no means driven by any kind of, biblical agenda of any kind. That you'll just find this kind of as a straight-up, conventional date for Amenhotep II. He is, if he's the pharaoh of the Exodus, he was about 3 years into his reign. It's a very interesting thing to look at his story, which is readily available. The first 3 years of his reign, he was out there fighting battles, doing stuff, running around. He was full of himself. He was kind of a pumped-up young man who wanted to go out and do great things on behalf of Egypt. Strangely, from 1447 on, he is dead silent. Nothing. One little skirmish toward the end of his career, But for a strange kind of, change of direction, this guy who seemed to be so full of himself just kind of fades. He's still reigning. He reigns for 30 years. Doesn't do diddly. He's followed soon enough by one of the greatest pacifist pharaohs in Egyptian history, Akhenaten, who comes some years later. In fact, the whole thing, now this is all arguing from kind of external circumstantial evidence, I grant you that, but at least looking on the face of it, it looks strangely like something rather dramatic happened in that year. The Egyptians don't mention it because, of course, they, like most ancient civilizations, were propagandists. They don't talk about their defeats, They only talk about their victories. Who's the first true, detached historian in ancient history who's willing to describe not only the victories but the defeats even of his own people? His name is? No, a little earlier than Josephus. That's a good thought. Herodotus, And he's down around 400 BC. Up until then, you read the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Hittites, all they talk about is the splendor of their glory and the might of their power and the wonderful, and you'd think they never lost a battle, you see, by the way they tell the stories. So we're not surprised that the Egyptians don't mention a colossal defeat that may have happened, but we are interested in the fact that there's not much more propaganda going on about great victories after that date. I don't think that proves it either way. I'm not trying to make that case. I'm just saying as an interesting sidelight, we sort of notice that. All right. Well, if it is the 18th dynasty, then who is the king that arose over Egypt who didn't know Joseph? Well, it's not this guy. It's an earlier pharaoh, obviously, who changed the policies. Presumably, it was the guy that founded the 18th dynasty. This goes back about 100 years, and it's a character by the name of Ahmose. Ahmose the First, who reigns beginning in 1570 and reigns for about 30 or 40 years, down to 1546 if you're interested. Ahmose is famous in Egyptian history because he founds what's called the New Kingdom, and he founds what's called the 18th dynasty, and he does that by driving out foreign rulers. The foreign rulers were called the Hyksos. The Hyksos, my friends, were foreigners and they were Semitic. They were not native Egyptians. They had infiltrated Egyptian civilization some couple of hundred years earlier, and through some kind of coup had actually been able to take over rule in Lower Egypt. That is the Delta region, northern Egypt. It's called Lower Egypt. And they had ruled for a couple of hundred years. They were hated by the native Egyptians. But they were Semitic. That's what's important. That probably accounts, at least in part, for why there was a favorable relationship between the Hyksos rulers, who were Semitic, and Joseph and his family, who were Semitic. They shared a kind of cultural, common bond there. But they were hated, generally, that is, the Hyksos were hated, by the native Egyptians. Ahmose was able to put together a military force that drove out the Hyksos, didn't destroy them, but drove them outside of Egypt and retook control of Egypt. And that's when the whole disposition toward these Semites changed. Because now, of course, Ahmose, who's looking over the situation in Egypt, realizes he's got a slave population there that is Semitic and has a lot of affection for the Hyksos. And he begins to worry because they're growing in population, growing in numbers, and he's really worried about their potential for becoming a fifth column within Egypt should the Hyksos return. This is speculative, but I'm just giving you a plausible treatment. All right. Having said all that, let's read these verses again. We'll do this quickly. I'm almost done. And then we'll talk about it. So a new king arose over Egypt. He said, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Anybody that runs an economy based on slave labor is always worried about slave uprisings. Rome always worries about a Spartacus, you know. You're always concerned. And so this guy, probably speaking a little bit hyperbolically, is concerned because it appears they're becoming more numerous, more powerful than the Egyptians. So let's deal shrewdly with them, or what? They will increase and in the event of war join our enemies. And if my chronology is right, that would be the Hyksos. There's no other enemies they were worried about. And fight against us. Should the Hyksos come back, these native Hebrews would probably join them, having more in common with them than with the Egyptians, and become a force from within that would, undermine the Egyptian effort to resist them. Therefore, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. We do have plenty of hieroglyphs from the 18th dynasty era showing these guys with whips in their hands, a famous quote, "The whip is in my hand, be not lax," that kind of thing. And many, many slaves who are given names are given Semitic or even Hebrew names. So at least in terms of correlating that to Egyptian records, it squares pretty nicely. They built the supply cities Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. There's the big problem. The problem is, however, that those cities have never been found anyway. Nobody's ever found cities that, welcome to Pithom. It's just never been found. These were certainly plausible names. I think the best theory among those who take the earlier date is that it is an anachronism, but it is an intentional anachronism. That the cities went by a different name at an earlier time, but in order to make it a meaningful discussion, the name of the city was changed so it would be comprehensible to the people reading the text. St. Petersburg eventually became what? Leningrad, and then Stalingrad, and then whatever, and the names of cities change, and if you're going to discuss a city, sometimes you'll use the more modern name, even though you're talking about an earlier era. That would be an intentional anachronism. I'm not real comfortable with that, but I think it's at least a plausible explanation for that. And I think it solves more problems than it creates to view that. So that's at least a common way of viewing that. They built these supply cities. These are not, by the way, this was mud brick. It doesn't survive very well over history. That's why it's been so hard to dig these up archaeologically. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread them. Here's my one Sunday school point today. The blood of the martyr is the seed of the church, Tertullian said. When you are put into stressful circumstances, it is for your good. God let his people come under this tyrannical abuse, but what happened? They were blessed. Some of you are here and you feel like you're going through difficult, stressful, agonizing, painful experiences. And you think, why is God doing this to me? It's so you will grow and become strong and flourish, just like the Israelites did. There's my Sunday school lesson, so I hope that helps you, especially if you're going through some difficult times. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. The Egyptians became ruthless and imposing tasks, made their lives bitter, and so on, ruthless in all the tasks they imposed upon them. All right, well, a lot of history today. We'll be doing a little more as we go along, but not quite this much.